My husband leaned across the table at our anniversary dinner and told my mother she was the help that forgot her place. He laughed, gesturing to her simple dress, and told the 40 guests that her little cleaning business was just a hobby for people with no ambition. He didn't know that my mother doesn't just run a business. She owns the global logistics firm that approves his quarterly bonuses. He thought he was putting a nobody in her place, but he was actually signing his own professional death warrant in front of everyone we knew. He was about to find out that the woman he just humiliated owns every single brick of the empire he's trying to climb. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The candles on the table flickered as a cold draft seemed to sweep through the room, though the windows were tightly shut. The restaurant was one of the most exclusive in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The air smelled of expensive wine and aged steak. Maya sat in the center of the long table, her heart heavy. It was her 5th wedding anniversary with Julian. What should have been a celebration felt like a high-stakes performance. Julian had insisted on inviting his entire social circle. He wanted everyone to see how far he had come. Julian was a senior vice president at a major firm. He was young, handsome, and dangerously ambitious. To Julian, life was a ladder, and he was determined to reach the top. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Maya's first car. He spent the evening discussing market shares and international acquisitions. He spoke with the self-assurance of a man who believed he was the most important person in any room. Then, there was Maya's mother, Elena. She sat at the end of the table. Elena was a quiet woman in her late 50s. She wore a simple, unbranded navy dress. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She had spent the evening mostly listening, offering a warm smile whenever Julian addressed her with his trademark cordial dismissiveness. This was a family gathering drama that Maya had tried to avoid, but Julian had insisted Elena attend. "It's good for your mom to see what real success looks like, Maya," Julian had said that morning. "Maybe it'll give her some ideas for her little cleaning service." The humiliation hit its peak during the main course. Julian stood up to make a toast. He started by thanking his colleagues. Then he turned his gaze toward Elena. The room went silent. The guests leaned in, expecting a heartwarming tribute. Instead, Julian's smile turned sharp and predatory. "I also want to thank Elena for coming," Julian said, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "It's not often someone from your background gets to dine in a place like this. I know those offices you clean are usually empty by the time you arrive with your mop. It must be a shock to see the people who actually run the world sitting right in front of you." A few of Julian's more arrogant colleagues snickered. Maya felt a wave of nausea. She gripped her glass so hard she thought it might shatter. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't look down at her plate. She looked Julian directly in the eye. Her expression was calm, almost pitying. Julian didn't stop. He was fueled by the wine and his own ego. "Don't get me wrong," he continued. "We need people like you to keep the background tidy. But Maya and we're building a brand. We're moving in circles where modest is just another word for unsuccessful. I hope you enjoyed the lobster, Elena. It probably costs more than your monthly revenue." The silence that followed was suffocating. This was professional disrespect at its most toxic. Julian looked around the room, expecting applause for his honesty. Maya looked at her mother, waiting for the hurt to show. But Elena simply took a slow sip of her water. She set the glass down with a soft click. "I built my business so I wouldn't have to announce my worth to strangers, Julian," Elena said quietly. Her voice was soft, but it carried a strange weight that made the snickering stop. "Expertise usually announces itself. It doesn't need to shout." Julian snorted and sat back down, leaning toward his boss. He whispered something about simple people with simple minds. He was so certain of his power. He was an entitled husband, humbled by nothing, or so he thought. He didn't notice Elena pull out her phone beneath the table. She wasn't calling a cab. She was logging into the executive portal of Lockswood Holdings. As Julian raised his glass for a final drink, Elena's thumb hovered over a specific notification on her screen. It was a request for an immediate restructuring of the subsidiary Julian worked for. She looked at her son-in-law, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. She had seen enough. The test was over. Julian leaned over to Maya and whispered, "I think your mom's a bit overwhelmed by the class in this room. Maybe we should send her home early." Maya looked at her husband, truly seeing the architecture of his arrogance for the first time. She knew what Elena was capable of. She knew the secret. She looked at her mother, and then back at Julian, who was currently bragging to his boss about a promotion he thought was guaranteed. Julian stood up to make one final toast to his unmatched career success, but his speech was interrupted by the vibration of every corporate phone at the table. Elena's smile didn't fade as Julian's boss paled while looking at his screen. Julian's boss looked up, his eyes darting between Elena and his phone. He whispered, "We just received an emergency directive from the parent company. We've been acquired." Julian frowned, his glass still held high. "Acquired? By who?" Elena stood up slowly, smoothing her modest dress. She looked at Julian, then at the silent table of executives. "By the person who owns the background you think is so beneath you, Julian." Julian's hand began to shake as Elena's phone chimed with the confirmation of a massive wire transfer, one that would change the balance of power in their marriage forever. Julian didn't just walk. He strutted through their Lincoln Park home like he owned the air Maya breathed. After the anniversary dinner, his ego had reached a fever pitch. He spent the entire ride home talking about branding. He told Maya that if they were going to climb the social ladder, they couldn't have dead weight dragging them down. He meant Elena. He meant her own mother. Julian started leaving brochures for luxury assisted living facilities on the kitchen island. He said it was time for Elena to retire from her little cleaning business and move somewhere she wouldn't embarrass them. Maya watched him from across the room, her heart feeling like a cold stone. He didn't see the silent tears she wiped away while he bragged about his guaranteed promotion to senior partner. He was obsessed with the trophy lifestyle. Every piece of furniture had to be designer. Every wine had to be vintage. He even suggested Maya get a refresh at a plastic surgeon's office to stay competitive among the other executive wives. The man she had supported through law school was gone. In his place was an entitled husband humbled by nothing, a stranger who valued optics over the woman who had built his foundation. The pressure intensified when Julian's firm announced a mandatory corporate gala. Julian cornered Maya in her home office, his face tight with fake concern. He told her she needed to call Elena and tell her she wasn't welcome. He said having a cleaning lady in the VIP section would be a PR nightmare for his promotion. Maya felt a sharp spark of awakening. She remembered the nights Elena worked double shifts to pay for Maya's college. She remembered the dignity in her mother's modest hands. Julian was asking her to trade her mother's heart for a title he hadn't even earned yet. He wasn't just being a snob, he was being a bully. Julian began monitoring Maya's phone calls, checking if she was still talking to Elena. He told her that DNA wasn't an excuse for low-class energy. Maya stayed quiet, but she started observing him back. She noticed how he hid his screen whenever he checked his investment portfolio. She saw the sweat on his upper lip when he talked about the upcoming audit at work. He was desperate to maintain the facade of a millionaire, even if it meant stepping on the neck of the family that loved him. One afternoon, while Julian was at the gym performing for his social media followers, Maya found his private briefcase. It wasn't locked. Julian was too arrogant to think Maya would ever dare to look. Inside, she found a hidden ledger. It wasn't corporate business. It was a trail of systematic fraud. Julian had been inflating his expense reports for over a year, stealing from the subsidiary to fund the very lifestyle he was using to belittle her. He was a parasite living off the grace of others while pretending to be the host. Maya's hands shook as she realized the man she shared a bed with was a criminal. He was willing to destroy her mother's reputation to hide his own rot. She looked at the stack of fake receipts and felt the last tether of her marriage snap. Julian thought he was the architect of their future. He had no idea that Maya was already sending scans of those documents to a private email address. She was done being the trophy. She was ready to be the reckoning. Just as she closed the briefcase, she heard the garage door groan open. Julian was home early. He burst into the room, his eyes scanning Maya's pale face with a sudden dangerous suspicion. He didn't look at her with love. He looked at her a problem that needed to be managed. Julian walked toward her, his voice low and threatening, asking why she was in his office. Maya gripped her phone tightly, the weight of the secret file burning in her pocket as she realized Julian was about to make a move she never saw coming. Julian's footsteps thudded down the hallway, heavy with the weight of a man who suspected his throne was crumbling. Maya barely had time to slide the ledger back into the briefcase before he burst through the office door. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes darting from Maya to the desk. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, predatory octave. Maya felt the adrenaline spike, but she forced her hands to still. She didn't let him see the terror, she let him see the disappointment. "I was looking for the tax documents Mother requested," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But all I found were lies, Julian." He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at her until the silence felt like it was bruising the air. Then he laughed, a short, jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes. Lies? I'm the one keeping this family afloat, while your mother plays pretend at business, he sneered, stepping closer until he invaded her personal space. He reached out and gripped the edge of the desk, pinning her in. He started lecturing her about the cost of victory and how a woman like her couldn't possibly understand the weight of corporate survival. He was using the same cordially dismissive tone he used on Elena, trying to make Maya feel small and incapable. But the architecture of his arrogance had a flaw. He assumed Maya was still the naive girl he had married. He didn't know that Elena had spent the afternoon showing her a different reality. Just hours earlier had taken Maya to an old unassuming warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. Inside wasn't dust and brooms, but a state-of-the-art command center for a global logistics empire. Elena had looked at the massive digital maps and told Maya the truth. She didn't stay hidden because she was ashamed of her cleaning roots. She stayed hidden to see who would remain loyal when the shiny exterior was stripped away. I signed off on Julian's hiring 4 years ago, Elena had whispered. I wanted to see if he was a builder or a parasite. I think we both have our answer now. Back in the office, Julian's phone began to vibrate incessantly on the desk. He glanced down, and for the first time, Maya saw a flicker of genuine fear cross his face. He snatched the phone up, his knuckles turning white as he read the screen. A surprise audit, he muttered, more to himself than to her. They're freezing the subsidiary accounts. He looked at Maya, his expression shifting from aggression to a desperate, manipulative softness. He reached for her hand, his touch feeling like a snake slithering over her skin. Maya, baby, I need you. Talk to your mother. Tell her I need a small loan, just a bridge to get through the audit. You know she has some cash stashed away from that little service of hers. Maya looked at him, seeing the rot in his heart clearly for the first time. He was literally a secret company owner's employee, begging for a handout from the woman he had called to help only nights before. He was asking her to help him embezzle from her own mother's empire to cover his fraud. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. She slowly pulled her hand away, realizing that Julian didn't just want her love. He wanted her silence and her mother's sweat. I'll talk to her, Julian, Maya said, her voice dripping with a cold, hard certainty. I'll tell her exactly what you've been doing. Julian's face paled, his confidence evaporating as he realized he wasn't the one holding the cards anymore. He started to scream, a frantic, unhinged rant about loyalty. But Maya was already walking out the door. She knew the corporate gala was only days away, and she knew exactly whose name was at the top of the invitation list. As she reached the front door, she checked her own phone and saw a message from Elena. The paperwork for his department is ready. It's time for him to see who really signs the paychecks. Julian returned home 3 days before the corporate gala, but he didn't bring flowers or apologies. He brought a storm of displaced rage. He slammed his designer leather briefcase onto the kitchen island, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent house. The internal audit at his firm was closing in, and his nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Instead of facing his own shadow, he turned his venom on Maya. He paced the kitchen, his voice a serrated blade as he blamed Elena's low-class energy for his sudden streak of bad luck. He claimed that having a mother-in-law who smelled like industrial floor wax had somehow tainted his professional aura. His entitlement finally reached a fever pitch of cruelty. He stood over Maya, his face flushed a dangerous shade of red, and began to insult the memory of her late father. He sneered that Maya's poverty-stricken DNA was finally showing through her expensive clothes. He told her she was ungrateful for the life he had provided, ignoring the fact that his lifestyle was funded by stolen company funds. Maya sat perfectly still, watching him. She didn't cry, she didn't plead. The pain had finally crystallized into a cold, hard clarity. She saw the parasite clearly now, stripped of his Tom Ford armor and his practiced corporate jargon. Julian's desperation made him reckless. He grabbed Maya's shoulders, his grip tight and bruising, and delivered a final ultimatum. He told her she had 24 hours to choose. It was either her mother or her marriage. He demanded she sign a letter of estrangement Elena would receive via courier the next morning. It was a play for absolute control, a final attempt to isolate Maya before his own fraud was exposed. But Julian had miscalculated the depth of a daughter's love and the resilience of a woman who had spent years being told she was nothing. The awakening was complete. Maya looked at the man she had once called her partner and felt nothing but a profound sense of release. She realized that the architecture of Julian's arrogance was built on a foundation of sand, and she was done trying to hold up the walls. She stood up, slowly prying his fingers off her arms with a strength that made him stumble back. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. She told him that for the first time in years she finally agreed with him. It was indeed time for a change. Julian watched her with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm as Maya walked toward the hallway. He shouted after her, demanding to know where she was going, but she didn't answer. She went straight to the guest bedroom and began pulling out the hidden suitcases she had packed weeks ago. She wasn't packing her own things. She was gathering Julian's. As she zipped the final bag, her phone vibrated with a message from Elena's lead counsel. The restraining orders were ready to be served. Maya looked at the gold wedding band on her finger, and without a second thought, she slid it off and left it resting on top of Julian's fraudulent ledger. The night outside was dark, but Maya had never felt more enlightened. She walked back into the living room where Julian was pouring himself a stiff drink to settle his shaking hands. She dropped his bags at his feet with a heavy thud. He stared at the luggage, then at Maya's empty ring finger, the silence in the room becoming suffocating. Before he could utter another insult, there was a sharp, authoritative knock at the front door. Maya checked the security camera on her phone and saw the process server standing on the porch, holding the legal papers that would strip Julian of his home, his marriage, and his mask. "Someone is here for you, Julian," she whispered, "and trust me, it's not the promotion you were expecting." The downtown skyline glowed with a predatory brilliance as Julian adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the car window. Tonight was the corporate gala, the night he was certain his name would be etched into the firm's legacy as a senior partner. He didn't care that Maya was no longer by his side or that his home was filled with legal notices. To Julian, those were just hurdles. He believed that power was the only currency that mattered, and once he had his new title, Maya and her mother would realize their mistake. He walked into the ballroom with his head high, performing the role of the unstoppable executive. The room was a sea of black ties and evening gowns, but Julian's eyes immediately locked onto a figure that didn't belong. Elena was standing near the front of the VIP section, talking quietly with a waiter. She wore the same simple dress from the anniversary dinner, looking utterly modest in a room full of peacocks. Julian felt a surge of adrenaline and fury. He marched toward her, ignoring the colleagues who tried to congratulate him. To Julian, Elena was a crasher, a stain on the high-class brand he had spent years manufacturing. He reached her side and leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I don't know how you got past the front desk, Elena, but your cleaning service doesn't have a contract here tonight," he sneered. He signaled to the nearest security guard, his face twisting with a cruel triumph. Julian told the guard that the woman was a trespasser and needed to be escorted out immediately to preserve the integrity of the event. He was so blinded by his own elitism that he didn't notice the guard's hesitation or the way the room was suddenly growing quiet. The security guard looked from Julian to Elena, but he didn't move to grab her. Instead, he stood at attention. Julian began to raise his voice, demanding action, but his words were cut short by a hand on his shoulder. It was Marcus, the CEO of the entire parent company. Julian's face broke into a desperate, seeking smile, expecting Marcus to help him clear the trash from the floor. But Marcus didn't even look at Julian. He stepped past him and bowed his head slightly toward Maya's mother. "We are honored you could join us, Madam Chairwoman," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. Julian's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor as the air left his lungs. The corporate reality hit him like a physical blow. The cleaning lady he had mocked was the person everyone in the room reported to. Elena finally turned her gaze to Julian. She didn't look angry. She looked like a judge delivering a final sentence. The entire board of directors formed a circle around them, their expressions cold and professional. Marcus handed Elena the microphone, and the silence in the room became oppressive. Elena looked directly at Julian, her calm smile finally reaching her eyes. "I believe there's an employee here who thinks I don't belong in this room," she said softly into the mic. "Julian, since you're so concerned with the background, it's time we discuss exactly what you've been doing with my company's money." Julian felt the floor vanish beneath him as he realized his career wasn't just ending, it was about to be dismantled in front of the very world he worshipped. Julian stood frozen in the center of the gala ballroom, the shattered shards of his champagne glass mirroring his fractured life. The hum of the city's elite died instantly as Elena adjusted the microphone with a grace that came from decades of quiet command. Marcus, the parent company CEO, stood behind her like a loyal sentry, making it clear to every executive in the room that the hierarchy had shifted. Julian's breathing became shallow as he looked at the woman he had called help and realized she was the architect of his entire professional world. He tried to speak to offer one of his practiced corporate apologies, but his throat was dry, paralyzed by the weight of his own arrogance. Elena's voice was calm, cutting through the silence with a dignity that Julian had never possessed. She didn't shout. She simply laid out the truth of the internal audit. She detailed how a high-powered attorney at a subsidiary firm had been systematically siphoning funds to finance a brand he couldn't afford. As she spoke, Maya stepped out from the shadows of the VIP lounge, her face a mask of disappointment and newfound self-respect. She stood next to her mother, holding the hidden ledger Julian thought was buried in his office. The betrayal in their marriage wasn't just about money. It was about Julian's attempt to erase Maya's history to build his facade. Julian looked around for an ally, but his colleagues moved away from him like he was a sinking ship. His boss paled, realizing that his own failure to monitor Julian had put the firm in the crosshairs of a global powerhouse. Elena looked at Julian, her gaze holding a humanitarian lesson he should have learned years ago. Dignity isn't found in the label of a suit, but in the hands of those who do the work. She told the room that success is built on responsibility and respect for human beings, two things Julian had discarded in his climb to the top. The reckoning moved from the ballroom to the legal realm within minutes. Security didn't escort Elena out. They stood by as two federal investigators, who had been guests at the gala, approached Julian. They presented him with a warrant for wire fraud and embezzlement, citing the evidence Maya had scanned and sent days earlier. Julian reached for Maya's hand, a desperate, manipulative gesture to keep her silent, but she stepped back and handed him her own set of papers. It was the formal petition for divorce, served in front of the very circle he had tried to impress. Maya whispered that she was reclaiming her name and her mother's legacy, leaving him with nothing but the debt he had manufactured. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Julian realized he had lost the house, the career, and the woman who had truly loved him. But the final blow came when Elena leaned in and whispered the one secret that would ensure he never worked in the city again. Julian sat in a reinforced metal chair in a windowless interview room, the fluorescent lights overhead humming like a swarm of angry hornets. His tailored suit was wrinkled, and for the first time his self-assurance had completely evaporated, replaced by a gray, sickly desperation. Across the table, Detective Miller spread out the evidence Maya had provided, including the secret ledger and the encrypted digital files. The forensic trail was undeniable. Julian hadn't just been skimming off the top, he had been laundering money through offshore accounts for years. Every luxury gift he had given Maya was actually a piece of evidence now, bought with funds stolen from the very company her mother owned. Back at the mansion, Maya stood in the living room, looking at the empty spaces where Julian's designer furniture had once defined her identity. Elena sat nearby, her presence steady and grounding, a stark contrast to the toxic pressure of the previous years. The healing process was beginning, but it was heavy with the weight of realization. Maya realized that by allowing Julian to belittle her mother, she had let him erode her own dignity. "He didn't just want the money, Mom," Maya whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He wanted to make us feel small so he could feel like a giant." Elena took her daughter's hand, her skin rough but her spirit unshakable, offering a humanitarian lesson in resilience. True worth is never determined by those who seek to exploit you. The legal fallout was moving with a cold, administrative speed. Mitchell Crane, the family attorney, arrived with a stack of documents that would finalize Julian's professional and personal exile. Because Julian had used marital assets to hide his fraud, the court had already issued a preliminary order freezing his personal accounts. He was facing 15 to 20 years for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. But Maya wasn't interested in the money Julian had left. She was focused on family responsibility and setting healthy boundaries that should have been there from the start. She told Mitchell to ensure that every cent Julian stole was returned to the company's employee pension fund. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the room, the front door opened. It wasn't Julian, but his mother, Evelyn, who had spent years looking at Maya like a budget brand shoe. She looked haggard, her usual mask of elitism shattered by the news of her son's arrest. She walked toward Elena, her hands trembling as she prepared to beg for the mercy her son had never shown. Maya stood up, her spine straight and her voice clear, ready to deliver a final message about respect and the consequences of betrayal. But before Evelyn could speak, a second car pulled into the driveway, and a man Maya hadn't seen in years stepped out, holding a folder that contained the one secret Julian was most afraid of. Evelyn didn't just walk into the foyer. She collapsed against the mahogany doorframe, her designer handbag slipping from her fingers and hitting the marble with a heavy thud. The man who had stepped out of the second car followed her inside, his expression grim and professional. Maya recognized him instantly as Elias, the retired detective who had been helping her navigate the shadows of Julian's double life. He held a manila folder with a firmness that suggested its contents were final. Maya stood her ground, her spine straight, feeling a strange sense of healing in the silence. She was no longer the girl who shrank under Evelyn's judgment. She was a woman reclaiming her dignity and her home. Evelyn's eyes were bloodshot as she looked at Elena. Gone was the woman who treated others like budget brand shoes. In her place was a mother shattered by her son's public disgrace. "Elena, please," Evelyn rasped, her voice trembling. "Julian is a good boy. He just got caught up in the pressure. Talk to your people. Tell them it was all a mistake." Maya felt a wave of empathy for the pain in the older woman's voice, but it was tempered by the memory of Julian's cruelty. She realized that Evelyn's elitism had been the blueprint for Julian's arrogance, and protecting him now would only nurture the rot. Elias stepped forward and opened the folder, revealing a series of offshore bank statements and flight logs. "It wasn't just embezzlement, Mrs. Smith," Elias said, his voice rhythmic and direct. "Julian wasn't just stealing to fund a lifestyle. He was preparing to disappear." He pulled out a photograph that made Maya's breath hitch. It was Julian at a private airfield, standing next to Chloe, Maya's former best friend. They weren't just business partners in fraud. They had been planning to leave the country together the moment the final deeds were transferred. The betrayal in Maya's marriage had layers she was only just beginning to peel back. Elena took a slow sip of her tea, her expression offering a humanitarian lesson in self-respect. She looked at Evelyn and spoke with a calm authority that silenced the room. "Expertise doesn't need to shout, Evelyn, and neither does justice," she said softly. Maya realized that her mother had known about Chloe all along, waiting for Maya to see the truth for herself so the awakening would be permanent. Elena explained that the audit wasn't just a corporate move. It was a way to protect the legacy for the employees Julian had been defrauding. The weight of the secret Julian most was finally on the table. Elias pulled a final document from the folder. A confession Julian had signed years ago regarding a botched property acquisition that had cost an innocent family their home. He had used Elena's subsidiary to bury the legal fallout, thinking he was untouchable. Maya looked at the wreckage of Julian's mask and felt a profound sense of family responsibility. She turned to the door, ready to close this chapter of humiliation. But a sudden notification on her phone changed everything. As she read the message, Maya realized Julian had one desperate move left, and it involved an asset Maya thought was safe from his reach. The Chicago morning air was crisp and clear 6 months after the storm that had dismantled Julian's house of cards. Maya stood in front of a sleek, glass-fronted building on the city's south side, watching the sunlight bounce off the new bronze plaque near the entrance. It wasn't a corporate skyscraper or a luxury high-rise built on the backs of defrauded investors. It was a community incubator, the Elena Loxwood Center for Entrepreneurial Excellence. Maya had dedicated her life to establishing a scholarship fund in her mother's name, specifically for first-generation entrepreneurs who, like Elena, knew that the most important work often started with a mop and a dream. Maya checked her watch, feeling a sense of peace that Julian's frantic lifestyle had never allowed. Julian was now a distant, gray memory, currently serving his first year of a 15-year sentence for wire fraud and embezzlement. He had tried to reach out from prison, still using the manipulative corporate jargon that had once charmed her. But Maya never opened the letters. She didn't need closure from a man who saw her only as an asset to be liquidated. She had found her own liberation in the silence. Julian had been a hard, painful lesson about the shape of a person. That character isn't formed by a tailored suit, but by the weight one is willing to carry for others. A modest sedan pulled up to the curb and Elena stepped out, looking exactly as she did on the night of the anniversary dinner. She wore an unbranded wool coat and comfortable shoes, her face free of the heavy makeup Julian had once demanded of her. As they walked toward the entrance of the new center, Maya realized that the hidden billionaire reveal wasn't really about the bank accounts or the global logistics firm. The true wealth Elena had been hiding all those years was a depth of character that no audit could ever quantify. She had stayed humble not to trick people, but to ensure that the love in her life was earned, not bought. They entered the lobby together as equals and partners. There were no snickering colleagues or toxic mother-in-laws waiting to judge them. Instead, they were greeted by the first group of scholarship recipients, young men and women who saw Elena as a beacon of dignity and self-respect. Maya looked at her mother's hands, those hard-working hands that had built an empire from nothing, and felt a surge of pride. She had learned that fairness and justice aren't just legal concepts. They are the boundaries we set to protect our own souls from those who seek to trample them. The day's African-American family gathering was different now, filled with authentic laughter and the shared responsibility of lifting up their community. Maya's mother-in-law revenge was complete, not because Evelyn had been humiliated, but because Evelyn had been forced to witness the very low-class energy she despised becoming the city's new gold standard for success. Maya leaned her head against her mother's shoulder as they cut the ribbon on the new building. She finally understood her father's old saying, "Never trust a lock that relies on force, but always keep your heart open to those who prove they have the moisture of truth in their breath." If this story reminded you that your worth isn't defined by someone else's opinion, hit that subscribe button. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who later had to eat their words? We're at 20,000 strong and growing. Be part of the journey. Until next time, keep your heart vengeful for justice, but open for joy.